Welcome. This is David the Real Med White, and today we're going to be reviewing the debate I did 2 days ago, 3 days ago, I think, somewhere around those times. I debated Paul Ibrahim and Mr. Daniel Kakish on Craig Truglia's live stream. So first of all, thank you to Craig. Thank you for your very kind words on Facebook. I'm not going to say what he told about me, but very kind words, Craig. I really appreciate it. And I want to talk about, I want to before I start, I want to kind of get some things out of the way. Number one is that there's been claims of mod bias, that Craig was biased towards me. And I think that's very strange because I had people from my side claiming that Craig was biased against me. So I think that's a sign of a good moderator, because if both sides claim that you're biased, then you must be unbiased, right? And another thing I want to note in relation to that is usually, I've lived for 21 years and I'm a very competitive person. I've observed competitions, I've been part of competitions, and one thing I have noticed is that usually claims of bias from a referee or a moderator has consistently been claims, unless it is very apparent, unless the bias is incredibly obvious, right? But it has always consistently been a complaint from the losing side. And I've seen a lot of Orientals using that. I have heard, keyword here is heard, maybe I'm wrong, that my opponent, not Mr. Kakish, because he himself was a moderator. He was kind of like a second moderator in the debate as well. But mainly Paul, again, this is what I've heard. Maybe what I've heard is wrong. There is a possibility to that. So take this with a grain of salt. But I've heard my opponent Paul uses that as a complaint and use that as an excuse to say, "Oh, I won that one because I got interrupted all the time and the mod was biased against me." So no, the reason why I interrupted him during the debates a lot of the times is not really because I was trying to be a dick, but it's because he was getting nowhere. And we have to say this openly. I mean, he was getting nowhere in his arguments. I felt like we were wasting time. And 1.5 hours, that's not a long time. That's a pretty short time. Okay, that's not pretty long. And I only got 2 questions in the whole debate. Did you notice that? I only got 2 questions in. And the 2 questions are basically the same question. Are the hypostases that are in union distinct, and is the hypostasis created or uncreated, right? The 2 questions are basically the same question. I didn't get any more questions than that, whereas I got questions piled on at me. Now, thankfully, there is still worth in defending the Council of Chalcedon, and I think I did a great job at that, patting myself on the back. Yes, I know I'm being very, very modest, and I'm a very nice, modest person, but really, jokes aside, thank you all for who watched it. You've been breaking viewing records, basically. There's been, right now, in my channel, there's been 1,000 people that watched the debate. In Craig's channel, there are 1.4 thousand people that watched the debate. So 2,500 people watched this debate already. And that's very exciting. And over time, the view numbers are just going to accumulate. And to compare my debate review of the debate that the fake Orthodox people made with Severus and Zealot, that debate got 1,000 views. My debate review got 2 times the views that video had. So just again pointing this out. And finally, I'm fine with debating Severus and Zealot, but the next debate I would like to have on this topic will be Severus of Antioch himself. I mean, that's kind of my expertise, and I didn't really get to debate that. I didn't really get to talk about that. And so I would love to talk about him, and I would love to talk about the doctrine of wills and energies in the Oriental Church historically, because I think this is a very important point for us to contend. Having said all that, let's begin with this debate review. Hopefully we will keep things short. I've already spent nearly 5 minutes talking about nonsense, so let's just get this out of the way. One of the people in the comments said that I lost the debate because apparently I said metaphysics is orthodox, therefore I admitted that my opponents were right. First of all, no, that's stupid. You're stupid if you think that. you haven't been paying attention to the debate. I said that the formula is acceptable in Orthodox conditions, and it is. The Eighth Anathema of the Fifth Ecumenical Council says so, right? There's two interpretations of this statement. By the way, the rejected anathematized interpretation is the interpretation that the Orientals themselves will reject. So I don't really see any point of them getting so hung up over this term. But the one nature of God, the Word, made flesh or infleshed, means two things. One thing is that the one nature, right? The term nature might mean hypostasis. So all it means that the person of Christ was infleshed in his incarnation. That's obviously what our dogma says. That's what we believe. The other thing that it can mean is that the divine nature was enfleshed, meaning that the divine nature came into a union with the human nature, right? I'm using terms that are orthodox, right? I'm not going to use Oriental terminology, but that's what it means. So these two interpretations are not wrong. These are the interpretations that we have for the formula. They're consistent, they're correct. So I don't see why this is a fight over metaphysics. We're not fighting against this formula, although there is some historical investigations that are supposed to be done. But we're also going to be questioning strict metaphysicism. That's the main thing that we're tackling, right? There is moderate metaphysicism that says diaphysis is also acceptable, that these two formulas run in tandem. And there's the strict metaphysitism that rejects all forms of diaphysitism. That's what we're tackling here. So there are also one thing I want to note is that one confusion that Paul had in the debate is that he kind of taught that we consider human nature to be unhypostatic or something akin to that. And I consistently have said that the hypostasis, the person is simple, right? He is simple. He's not composed of parts. He's not composed of other hypostases. He's a simple divine hypostasis, right? So the person, the hypostasis, is only divine and it's uncreated. And we're going to get to why that's more plausible. But here's an analogy from the Answer of Jerusalem. You can find this in Defense of Chalcedon in the East. If you want that book, you can pay $225 on Amazon. Or I paid a lot of money for that book, so I'm going to be using that book a lot. So Leontius makes an analogy of the hypostatic union. Of course, now analogies can only go far to a certain point, right? So they're not one-to-one all the time. But this is a good analogy because it explains how there can be a nature that does not have its own corresponding hypostasis, but it's united to another nature that has its own hypostasis, right? So it says here, steel, which is burned in charcoal, neither takes on a new nature nor a new hypostasis, right? Steel still remains steel. But the hypostasis of the steel and the hypostasis of the burning coals, they're still the same. But the hypostasis of the steel, the nature of fire, being of itself without an hypostasis of its own, is joined to the nature of the steel, becoming co-hypostatic with it. So what does this mean? Well, fire does not have its own, fire is a nature, but it doesn't have its own hypostasis, right? So again, this is an analogy. And so fire, because steel is burned in charcoal, the fire can only exist in the mode of its union with steel, right? So the hypostasis of the fire is actually the steel. That's why it's co-hypostatic with it. And so likewise, the human nature is co-hypostatic with the divine nature, right? You can say that. That is an acceptable way to explain the union. And that's why it's a hypostatic union, right? That's a hypostatic union. So I mean, I'm gonna get to the part, but this is why Severus and Nestorius, who are of one mind in this topic, this is why they're wrong, because the unity of steel and fire was not an abstract unity. It wasn't a unity that happened in some Platonic realm that we just think of or we just remember. That's not how it happened. How it happened is that in the hypostasis of the steel, fire united to it. That's what the hypostatic union is. So for example, the human nature of Christ and the divine nature of Christ united themselves in Christ's hypostasis. That's why it's a hypostatic union. So let's look at Paul's understanding of hypostasis. This is going to be incredibly crucial because from the two questions that I got to ask, we can derive many different things and many different problems in his Christology that also has implications in Trinitarian theology. So, hypostasis now has been reduced to a certain category, which is property. This is something that the fathers never do. They never reduce hypostasis to something like property. They don't reduce it to nature. They don't reduce it to, when I say nature, I mean essence, but they don't reduce it to will or energy. They don't reduce it to those things, right? So Paul does not distinguish between what a thing is and what a thing has, right? So property is something that a thing has. Hypostasis is what something is. Paul collapses these two things and says what the hypostasis is what he has too, right? So if you were to use a real life analogy, if I have a car, I am a car. This is how stupid this is. The hypostasis is out of two hypostases, for, as Paul will say, sets of properties that become one. Well, now, if you notice, when I asked the question, right, there's a union of two hypostases, but these two hypostases, they're still distinct, right? They're still distinct after the union. And he said, well, no, the hypostases aren't, the properties are. And that kind of confused me, because this is also very important, because this union is supposed to be a synthetic. Now, in a synthesis, the things that are synthetically united do not lose their identity. This is very key, because that's a major difference between what a synthesis is and what a mixture is. In a mixture, there's a loss of identity, right? But in a synthesis, there is no loss of identity. So the things that are synthesized still remain what they are. And the point is that if the hypostatic union of the Orientals, the union of two hypostases, if that's a synthesis, then the human hypostasis and divine hypostasis retain their identity. And my whole point is that if they retain their identity and if they're really distinct even after the union, then you necessarily have to speak of two hypostases even after the union. It doesn't matter if you say that the human hypostasis is non-self-subsistent. That only explains what you want it to happen. But what in reality happens, you have to speak of two, because there are two things and they're distinct from each other. So he said, no, that's not it. So I thought he was talking of mixture, but then he said hypostasis is the properties. And he still spoke of two properties, so my argument still stands. And he himself said that there are two properties, but one hypostasis. Now, if hypostasis equals property, and if there's one hypostasis and two properties, then unfortunately, Paul has failed algebra by making this basic mistake. And that's all I try to point out. And I don't think he understood. I don't think he listened. Or maybe he pretended not to understand. Because maybe he kind of knew that. And he must have known that some of the arguments I will make, he must have known those arguments because I made it to other people on Discord. So there is that. Another question that's a different variation of this is the one composite hypostasis created or is it uncreated? And there are three answers to this. If it's created, then it is not divine. Otherwise, you have something that's divine and created. That's polytheism, right? Created divinity. Something that we will get to this. It's actually also relevant to this debate. If it's uncreated, then it's not human, because what is human cannot be uncreated. If it could be, then Stephen Bar-Sudaili was right, and every human person will become consubstantial with God in the eschaton. That's straight up what it will lead to, really simply. So that's not true either. That is impossible. So the only answer is both, right? But here's the problem with that. If it's both, well, we're talking about the hypostasis itself. So we're not talking about, so for example, we can speak of the hypostasis as being created and uncreated in some sense, but that's proper to their natures, right? And the hypostasis manifests the properties that it has. So the hypostasis manifests impassibility, but also passibility, right? But what we are asking here about the composite hypostasis is not what it manifests, it's what it is, right? What is the hypostasis? Is it created or is it uncreated? What the hypostasis itself is. Paul, I asked him numerous times, could not get this. Or maybe he did get it, but he just realized, well, if I answer him honestly, he's going to point out that my Christology leads to Nestorianism, right? How does it lead to Nestorianism? Well, one thing cannot be simultaneously created and uncreated, right? So for it to be both, there needs to be two things. There needs to be some things that are created and some things that are uncreated. But wait a second. If the hypostasis has hypostases that are created and uncreated, guess what? That's Nestorianism. Again, it leads to this. And what I'm saying is not that this Christology is deliberately being Nestorian, rather that in its attempt to avoid Nestorianism, it still leads to Nestorianism. It still leads to that conclusion. And I know this is kind of strange because aren't the Orientals the opposite of Nestorians? Yes, they are. But that's why we are not to be thinking with dialectics, because sometimes truth can be stranger than fiction. So there are Trinitarian implications to this, because hypostatic properties becomes the hypostases themselves. This is Damian of Alexandria's response to Peter of Antioch. So the attributes are now hypostatized, right? So the Father is unbegotten. So that's an attribute that's hypostatized. The Son is begotten. The Spirit is spiritus. So this is very close to the Eunomian heresy. It's again a confusion of what God has and what God is. And I'm very certain that the Cappadocian Fathers in their Trinitarian formulations did not do this. So some people might find quotes, but I also want to make this argument. I made this argument in the debate itself, but there's a distinction between the is, right? This is terminological. The is of predication and the is of identity. So, for example, if I said, I used the example of the debate, I am brown, right? If I said that I am brown, does that mean I'm identified with brownness? If that was the case, then everyone that's brown is identified with me, which is stupid, right? So brownness, I'm not identical to brownness. Brownness is not identical to me, but brownness is predicated on me, right? It can be predicated something about me. Maybe my eyes, maybe my skin color, or maybe something else. Maybe my favorite color, right? It can predicate multiple different things, but it's not identical to my identity, right? So for example, we will say that the Father is unbegotten, but that's a predication. We're not saying that the unbegottenness is identical to the Father, right? These are two distinct things. So I kind of wanted to talk about that as well, lest people become confused. Speaking of confusion, there's a real confusion of essence and person, because Paul only distinguishes essence and person with the mode that they exist in. So their distinction is only between the mode of their existence, and this means that ousia is the abstract. It's the collection of hypostasis. By the way, this is reductionist, and I will claim even nominalistic, because you're just defining what ousia is by seeing what the particulars is. So the general is just a collection of all the particulars, and essence is supposed to be something that's immovable, right? It doesn't change. The essence doesn't it's invariant. But particulars change, right? So there needs to be more things in detail. It's very confusing. Maybe Paul himself can explicate on it in another instance, if he can, maybe in personal conversations. But as far as I can see, if person is basically the essence that exists, then there's a confusion of primary substance and secondary substance. What does it mean? There's a confusion of nature and person, essence and person. And if there's a confusion of essence and person, then, you can watch my video on Roman Catholicism leads to heresies. That's basically what it will lead to. It will either lead to tritheism or it will lead to Sabellianism. Pick your poison. It will either lead to Nestorianism or Eutychianism. Again, pick your poison. If they're identical, of course, right? If you were to believe that. So for them, the divine essence equals the Holy Trinity. And in this system, I didn't note this in the debate, but Communicatio idiomatum, the exchange of properties, becomes exchange of hypostases. So the hypostases in the composite hypostases are exchange in this theology. I don't think that makes any sense. So now let's look at the Orthodox understanding of hypostasis, what it is. So it is distinct from all categories, right? It's its own thing, right? Hypostasis is something that we approach apophatically. We don't identify it with something. It's a category on its own. The essence, unlike what Paul says, it's not merely something that's abstract, it's something that is real, right? It's not nominal. It's not something that's just a nominal reductionistic description of some certain things. And a question I would like to ask for these people that believe essence is merely in the abstract, how can God be beyond being if essence is just abstract? Right? Because beyond being means beyond essence, right? Because all things that exist has a essence. So how can he be beyond being? It doesn't make any sense. Will and energy are faculties of nature, but they're also enhypostatized, just like the nature is also enhypostatized. So when we speak of the will of Christ, we're not speaking of a general human will, right? But the human will of Christ is the human will that Christ has. It's his own thing, right? And so the human will can have the mode of feeling that pertains to the hypostasis, right? All of these things that we have talked about consistently here. And so, again, these properties are not the faculties, these are not just general things, but the things that the personal subject, Jesus Christ, the one person subject, possesses, right? The divine hypostasis is simple, it's uncreated, so there's only a divine person. So the pre-incarnate Logos is the same person post-incarnate Logos, right? He didn't change. He's the same exact person. They're the same exact person. And so just before the incarnation and after the incarnation, the hypostasis is the same, right? What it manifests has now become different. But the hypostasis is not what it manifests, right? It's not identical to what it manifests. But the hypostasis does manifest now new human things. Hypostatic properties are distinct from the hypostases themselves. They're not the same thing. There's an exchange of properties. So the humanity shares in the divinity. The humanity of Christ shares in the divinity and vice versa. And that means that both, it's just an emphasis on the personal mode of existence of Christ's two natures, right? They're not separate things. They're not two different things that one exists here and the other exists there. No, they exist in the one person, right? So they're hypostatic. They're enhypostatized. Now, on the topic of hypostatic union, as I mentioned before, for us the hypostatic union is a union of two natures in the hypostasis of Christ, right? This is what the hypostatic union means. Severus and Nestorius are in agreement on this, that for them that doesn't make any sense, right? So for example, on the left you say that they shall not advance to this madness as to declare that they're using the terms natures instead of generic signification. I mean signification of substance, right? So if you mean nature is synonymous with substance, then that means that the Holy Trinity is incarnate with the entirety of humanity. Because, well, it's just a collection of hypostases, right? So what is predicated on one nature is predicated on all hypostases. Sorry, but that doesn't make any sense at all, right? That's not what nature only means. So if that was the case, then we cannot in any way say that all the persons in the Trinity possess the fullness of the divine essence. But they do. They do possess the fullness of the divine essence. So that Christ has the fullness of the divine essence. The Father has the fullness of the divine essence. The Holy Spirit has the fullness of the divine essence. Human beings have the fullness of the human essence as well. But in Severus' view, this is impossible. And Nestorius, Theodotus, and Eutyches gives evidence of this in the First Council of Ephesus. He says the same thing. He says, if it is God the Word, second person of the Trinity, is made flesh, then you must confess, right? It means that he takes on human nature. Then you must confess that the Holy Spirit and God the Father himself have equally been made flesh, because the Trinity is threefold but only one in substance. This also proves that the hypostatic union of Saint Cyril of Alexandria is ours, right? It's our understanding of hypostatic union, not this union of two hypostases that come together. It's not that. Otherwise, why will Nestorius make such a comment, right? And the funny thing is, when Nestorius made this argument that Severus makes a century later, people thought he was stupid and illiterate. But a century later, it seems like you become a genius when you make the same argument. One of the things that was claimed, let me get my water break. Typical water break for long talks. One of the claims that Paul made is that the term gnorizumenon does not mean in contemplation like I claim. It only means acknowledged. And he said, I looked at the dictionaries, that's only what it says. So, first of all, I don't know what dictionaries you looked at, but if you looked at modern dictionaries, then you're a lol cow. If you looked at ancient dictionaries, then you're less of a lol cow. But the thing about this is that we don't, like, looking at dictionaries to find what terms mean, I don't think it really helps anyone. Plus, many of the scholars that look into this issue, that know about that term, that know Greek, right? All of these scholars, they know Greek. They speak Greek. They have learned Greek. They can read in Greek. Ancient Greek, right? The Greek of that time. And they all agree that gnorizoumeno means made known in contemplation. So let's look at the examples. This is Patrick Gray's book, The Defense of Chalcedon in the East. We're going to read the first section, and you can pause if you want to read the rest. He says... he's talking about, yes. So he's talking about qualifications to make sure that the distinction does not mean division. The same concern is shown in the use of the word gnorizumenon, right? If you can't read Greek letters, then that's sad, but that means gnorizumenon, which guarantees that the distinction is one made by thought rather than a division made in concrete, right? The distinction is not made in concrete, and at the end, I'm going to explain what this entails and what it means, right? And you can pause, but the first, I believe, 10 pages, the first 2 chapters of the book, is basically defending the Council of Chalcedon and defending its Cyrillianism, and that whole section can have its own video. And there's also this section as well that further on defends certain other terms used in the Chalcedonian definition, like prosopon and hypostasis being used together is a recognized Cyrillian formula. Let's move on. More history, right? This is Father John McGuckin's book, Cyril of Alexandria and the Christological Controversy. He basically says the same thing. He says, gnorizumenon, well, it means intellectually perceived, right? The page 237, look at the footnotes, means intellectually perceived. Father McGuckin also knows Greek. This is from Joseph Farrell's God History Dialectic. He says that for gnorizumenon, moreover, the word gnorizumenon or in knowing was added, meaning that this distinction is made by thought only, rather than acknowledged to be a concrete distinction in and of themselves. The natures are still real, very key thing to say, but it's not concrete. So what does it mean? Let me explain this in layman's terms. The distinction is real, but if it was a concrete distinction, then what we will be doing is that there will be 2 concrete things to distinguish, right? There will be human nature that's a concrete thing, and a divine nature that's a concrete thing. But if you're distinguishing 2 concrete things, well, there's 2 things, right? There are 2 concrete things that leads to 2 persons, right? This is the error of Nestorius. Nestorius makes this error. Now, Chalcedon, what it does is that it distinguishes these natures in thought because there's only one concrete subject. That's the one person, Jesus Christ. And the 2 natures are concretized in the one person. So we can distinguish these natures, but the method of distinction is different. And you can check out David Bradshaw's excellent video of distinction kat epinoia. I mentioned this in the debate. He talks about this, and many of the fathers use this distinction to distinguish various different things for various other reasons. So this is not the only purpose of distinction kat epinoia, but there's also various different reasons as well. And this is a very strong argument because people claim that, Chalcedon, it allows for prosopic union. Actually, it doesn't allow for a prosopic union, if you keep that in mind. It actually rejects prosopic union. So that argument is refuted. So another thing I want to note to Paul, and I didn't want to tell him during this debate because I knew that if I told him that, it will just confuse and it will just make the debate more turbulent. Now we'd had something extra to deal with. But Severus of Antioch actually rejects 2 properties. He believes the 2 properties became one. So both createdness and uncreatedness is the one property. This is, again, this is subject to the same criticism I use. There's a distinction of the set of properties, right? And so this, because there's a distinction, there needs to be two. So Severus's response to Julian of Halicarnassus is really stupid. But to give you context about this argument, is Julian's argument against Severus was this. Well, we know that nature, meaning hypostasis for them, it has like properties proper to the nature, to the hypostasis. We know that. But you're saying that the human nature is distinct. You're saying that the human properties are distinct. You're saying that Christ is mutable in his humanity, but immutable in his divinity. And then Julian's argument is that does not make any sense, because if you distinguish them, then there are two properties. But if there are two properties, then there must be two natures, because property is proper to nature. And if there are two natures, you're Nestorian because you suddenly now believe in two natures. So Severus basically says, no, I don't, but they're still distinct, but they're not two properties. So it's basically just Thomistic word salad. Kudos to Paul for not doing that in terms of properties, but maybe he just doesn't know. So this is text 13 of the Paul and Allen collection. Again, I knew this during the debate. I just didn't want to say it. It's not me like hiding truth, but it's me. It will even probably do worse for the truth, because I think it will just bring more chaos into the debate. So I kind of hit this, but again, it doesn't make any sense. It still, nevertheless, does not make any sense. Createdness and uncreatedness is the same set of properties and services. That doesn't make that's not comprehensive. So in terms of hypostasis equal to hypostatic properties, Damian of Alexandria does this. There was a debate between Damian and Peter, right, the two patriarchs, over this. So this is Christ and Christian Tradition by Olo Grillmeyer. It's volume 2, part 4. It says Damian had asserted that the characteristic properties of the hypostases of the Holy Trinity are the hypostases themselves, right? He said further that the general ousia is truly God. The three hypostases, on the other hand, he recognized as God only in a metaphorical sense and through participation. So what does this mean? Well, it means, here's what it means. It means that there is one God, the divine ousia, the divine nature, and the three persons in the Godhead participate in this ousia. Now, make of that what you will, but that does. I will argue for many Orientals and for Orthodox and for Roman Catholics. Do you guys think this makes any sense? I don't think it does. I think it's stupid. But let's see more things that Damian said, because this is very important in regards to Trinitarian theology and its the Christology's implications of Trinitarian theology. Here are some of the quotes that he uses. This is Peter quoting Damian's sentences, word for word, right? Exactly. The person of the divinity do not mean the divinity, right? So he's trying to distinguish the persons from ousia. It is polytheistic to recognize each person of the divinity. It is polytheistic to recognize each person of the Holy Trinity as God. The hypostasis and the divine ousia are in concept different things. Now wait a second. In concept, but in concrete, are they really different things? Right? Question mark. Maybe he's doing distinction katepinoia. Maybe he's doing something else. Right? Maybe he's saying they're identical, but they're only distinct in concept. The hypostasis of the Trinity appear as a metaphorical concept. So now the hypostases are now concepts, and they are without real existence. Damian calls the hypostases Father, Son, and Spirit as names and titles, and seems to accept them only in theoria. So, again, this is the Trinitarian theology of the Oriental Church. It's right here. The sources are right below. I have no comments. Make of what you will. This is the area where I cannot say, because if I speak, I might have to speak too much. So let's get to the quote mines on the Tome of Leo. And before I do that, I need to drink because my throat is dry, and I've been speaking for 35 minutes. So I think I need to hurry. and get past this part. But the main criticism in the debate against the Tome of Leo was this section, right? God is not changed by the showing of pity, man is not swallowed up by the dignity. For each form does what is proper to it with the cooperation of the other. By the way, the section with the cooperation of the other is omitted in Severus's writings. You can go check them out for yourself. He regularly omits that passage. But that is the word performing what pertains to the word. So it's very evident that what he considers the word in this sentence is a form. Now, in Latin theology, form means substance. Doesn't mean person, right? So he's saying the word is the divine nature, right? It's basically grammatically using that term. St. John of Damascus does the same in his dialogue against the Muslims. He himself says so, right? The word of God, he says, is like grammatically identical to the divine nature. But he doesn't say that the person of the Logos is the same as the divine nature, right? The word pertains what pertains to the word, right? And the flesh carrying out what pertains to the flesh. One of them sparkles with miracles, the other succumbs to injuries. So they look at this and they say this is Nestorian. But my point in the Florilegium, that the mini Florilegium I did in the debate, was that there are many other fathers that say the same thing St. Leo is saying. And St. Leo says what many of the fathers say in other places as well. So let's get through these things. This is also very important. So he also says that because of which the outrage is common in both is one thing, and that because of which the glory is common is another. So what he's saying is that although the form of God and the form of the human do things proper to it, the common outrage and the common glory is proper to both as well. So there's a real communication of properties. There's a real exchange of properties. So what is proper to the humanity is asserted to the divinity as well. The divinity shares in the humanity, and the humanity of Christ shares in the divinity, right? But when we speak of the term divinity and humanity, very important to make this point. This is grammatical. It's called grammatical subjects, right? So so you can speak of the natures as grammatical subjects, but that does not mean that the natures are really in reality subjects, right? This is a distinction again that Paul and many of the Orientals miss out on, and because they don't make this distinction, that's why their theology leads to monothelitism and monoenergism. So let's go. Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Book 5 against Eunomius. He says that it's not the human nature that raises up Lazarus. So there's a human nature after the hypostatic union, and it does not raise up Lazarus. So again, the human nature is treated as a grammatical subject in St. Gregory of Nyssa. And what is said? But St. Gregory of Nyssa does Communicatio idiomatum. So does St. Leo. It's not the power, the divine power the divine power does not suffer, does not weep for him who lies in the grave. The tear proceeds from the man, the human nature, the life from the true life. It is not the human nature that feeds the thousands. Nor is it the divine nature that hastens to the victory. Right? Saint Hilary of Poitiers on the Trinity, Book 9, Section 11. Death is attributed to the man, human nature, and the quickening of the flesh to the God, divine nature. See his divine nature in the power to raise again, and recognize in his death the dispensation of his manhood. And though either function is performed by its proper nature. Again, St. Augustine in his tractates, let us recognize the double nature of Christ, that is the divine in which he is equal to the Father, the human whereby the Father is greater, but the two are together. There are not two Christs, but one. And what's really great about this is that this also refutes Nestorianism. So he's actually refuting Nestorianism because he's pointing out where Nestorian argumentation leads to, right? Otherwise, God will be a quaternity, not a trinity, blah, blah, blah. Christ Jesus, okay. Who is it then through whom the world was made? Christ Jesus, but in his nature as God. Who is it that was crucified under Pontius Pilate? Christ Jesus, but in the nature of a slave. So it's the one and the same person, but he was crucified in his humanity, and he made the world in his divinity. And against the Arians, this is more St. Augustine. He very obviously speaks of two natures. He says, he showed that there was one person in the two natures, that is God's and man's, right? And then again, against the Arians, he says, and thus on account of the unity of the person that we must understand in the two natures, the Son of Man is said to have come down from heaven, although he was assumed from the Virgin who was already on earth. Again, in two natures from St. Augustine. Now some Copts might say, but St. Augustine is not a saint in our church. Really? Go search St. Augustine Coptic Orthodox Church and you will see many churches in his name calling him a saint. If he's not a saint, but you have churches dedicated to him, referring to him as a saint, then I think you have bigger problems. So yeah, just Google him and you will find numerous churches. To my knowledge, all of these churches are canonical. They're not uncanonical. They are under the jurisdiction of legitimate Oriental patriarchs. So I'm not making these churches up. I didn't pay pages to make pages for imaginary churches. These are real churches. So in Ephesus 1, St. Ambrose was read. And St. Ambrose speaks of a distinction of the Godhead from the flesh. So there's a distinction of two natures after the union. But if there's a distinction of two natures after the union, then there are two natures, right? In each of these natures, there speaks one and the same Son of God. For each nature is present in him. It is the same person who speaks, but he doesn't speak always in the same manner. So he speaks in humanity and he speaks in divinity. Now behold in him now the glory of God, now the affections of man. As God he speaks the things of God because he is the Word. As man he speaks the things of man because he speaks in my nature. St. Gregory of Nyssa says in the Fourth Theological Oration, thus everyone must see that he knows as God and knows not as man, that we are to understand the ignorance in the most reverent sense by attributing it to the manhood and not to the Godhead. St. Sylvester, Bishop of Rome, against the Jews, this is attested by John Maron. He says, of the two natures united in him, one succumbs to injury, but the other is shown to be greater than any suffering. Right? Verbatim what St. Leo says a century later. Well, not a century later, but yeah, it is a century later. And St. Cyril of Alexandria himself, right? From the Glaphyra, he says, he orders two small living clean birds to be taken, St. Cyril says, so that you might understand from winged creatures that man from heaven at once man and God in two natures. And on the right, this is Patrologia Graeca, volume 69, 576b. The whole translation is the translation of the Glaphyra, right? This is from the Glaphyra and the Pentateuch. This is his Old Testament commentary. This is a commentary of the Pentateuch that St. Cyril of Alexandria does, and he uses the term in two natures. Very explicit. One of the most explicit statements of in two natures is from St. Cyril of Alexandria. And remember what Daniel Kakish said in his first talk with Craig Truglia on reason and theology. He points out that Severus' challenge was, show me a father who speaks of in two natures. Mr. Kakish, here you go. In two natures in St. Cyril of Alexandria. And what did Paul say? Paul tried to grapple around the question. It's just in two natures in contemplation. It's not really in two natures. No. He's not saying anything different than what we are saying. Okay? He's saying what we are saying. He's not saying what you are saying. If he said what you said, and we said at the same time, then that will only mean that your schism was for no purpose. Because this is what the Chalcedonian definition says, and as I already proved, gnorizumenon means exactly that. So you can't argue that gnorizumenon somehow means something else. No, it was deliberate. Okay, it was deliberate. It was deliberate. There was a reason why they added that qualification. Let's move on to St. Cyril and his Diophysite statements. These quotes I've got from Hans van Loon's book on the Cyril of Alexandria's Diophysite Christology. He says in his Festal Letter 17, Christ allowed the nature like ours to move according to its own laws. Oh, so there's a nature like ours that moves according to its own laws. On the incarnation and in his letter to the emperor, he who according to the law of the flesh and according to the nature like ours has died and who was raised. You can read the source yourself. I'm not going to read them out. St. Cyril says that Christ has become man by nature. This is very key because this says exactly what I said in the debate. Often with regard to one person, the appearance of our speech introduces two persons. Now, I'm sorry that I'm going to be very polemical here, but I'm seeing this way too much. But now I can understand that very basic language games that an elementary school student can do is very difficult for Orientals. I understand that this is very difficult for people like Paul. Again, I'm going to be very polemical because I'm sick of dealing with this objection that I'm hearing. Because what are we attacked for? We are attacked for speaking of two natures and predicating them as grammatical subjects. But as I said, grammatical subjects do not necessarily mean an ontological subject. Okay, so get that through your thick heads, please. It's not really that difficult to understand. And St. Cyril of Alexandria himself, in his letter to the emperor, he says, yes, in our speech, we introduce two persons. There are two grammatical subjects that we speak of at times. But there's only in reality, right? In reality, what we speak of is always one person. And there's no union of persons either. There's no external union either. There's a real union. There's really a single person. It's not two persons. It's not one composite person made out of two persons. Okay? But it's just one person. But it's only verbally speaking when we attribute certain things to what is proper to his certain natures. That's when our speech introduces two persons. But this is basic linguistics. Okay? This is basic linguistics. It's not really that difficult. Please understand this. It's really simple. Please. I'm a little bit mad because I can't fathom that there are people that are so stupid that they can't understand this. Please. Be a little charitable and try to understand it. Thank you. Next letter. Is indeed being able to execute the works of the divinity fitting to the human nature? Of course not. Obviously. More quotations. I'm not going to read all of them. Some from On the Incarnation, some from Festal Letter 17, some from Contra Nestorium. We're going to get to that topic later on. St. Cyril says, observe then, this is book 3 against Nestorius, observe then the word born of God, magnificent as God, in the highest glory and on the throne of the Godhead, and the same one, right? The one and the same, this term comes up many times in both St. Leo's tome and also in the Chalcedonian definition. One and the same, right? The one and the same is in the highest glory on the throne of the Godhead, is also the same one as the one that executes the office of a priest as man. It's the same person. Exactly this is what we believe. It's the same person. It's not really that difficult to understand. The second letter of St. Cyril to Nestorius is that the difference of the natures is not taken away by the union. He doesn't say that the difference is attributed to something else, that Paul initially tried to go with it, but then he said, well, whatever, nature equals property anyway. But he's not attributing the difference to something else. He's attributing the difference to the natures. Now, if there's a difference of natures after the union, how can there be only one nature? Please, explain that to me. Because it's not possible. Because there must at least be two if there's a distinction. Because distinction introduces plurality, right? Second letter to Soccensis. This is very huge. Soccensis says, as I stated in the debate, he says, well, is it correct to say that God suffered in his human nature? And St. Cyril says, yes, God did not himself suffer bodily things in his own nature, in his own divine nature, but he suffered in his earthly nature, in his human nature. And if you're going to say that, oh, he's talking about hypostasis in contemplation, then you're doing two things. Number one, what you're doing is Nestorianism, right? So this time now you are the Nestorian. Even if you're doing it in contemplation. If I try to use Oriental standards for who is Orthodox and who is not, then if I did the same thing that they did, I will say, be very annoyed. And if I did this, I will say, well, in speech, you're introducing two persons, dude. Isn't that Nestorian? Right? But also you're saying that suffering, right? These things are proper to hypostasis, not the nature. And this also indicates that you think the faculties are proper, that the faculties are from hypostasis, not essence. This is going to be very relevant in the controversy regarding the wills and energies. Let's go. Right, so this is a statement from one of the people in the chat. I'm not going to name him, but I'm sick of his nonsense because he doesn't seem to listen. I talked with this guy in person. I gave him a lot of my arguments before the debate, and I only gave it to him. And then it seems like Paul anticipated some of the arguments that I will be using. 2 + 2 = 4, you know what I'm saying. So I'm sick of dealing with this person, and I know that they're going to check this video out, and I just want to be honest. You're not listening. I'm sorry, but you're not listening to the things that I'm saying to you, because the moment I say to you X, tomorrow you say that I said Y, and it's impossible to talk with you. Now you're trying to be very polemical for no apparent reason to people, and I have to do this. So I'm not going to name this person. He doesn't want fame, right? Don't give him fame. He himself says that he doesn't want fame. So let's take him up on his words. But, right, he will use some arguments, right? Which form is flogged during the passion and which is glorified in eternity. But then he makes this argument. So we will get to the part that really makes me angry. They seem to think we submit to the anathema any mention at all of two. But in fact, two natures and one nature both must receive the proper qualification. Two natures and one... No. Two natures cannot be said in any way. It's unacceptable in all ways. It's only after Severus saw these quotations that actually, if you look at the Saint Justinian book on the person of Christ, he quotes Severus numerous times, who says, I know Saint Cyril uses into natures, but we shall never use it because it was poisoned by Nestorians. Right? That's something that he says. This is quoted by Saint Justinian, so they're not going to believe it, obviously. But therefore, this is what he quotes, which I think is very funny. When we anathematize those who say Emmanuel has two natures after the union and speak of the activities and properties of these, we're not saying this as subjecting to anathema the fact of speaking or naming natures or activities or properties, but speaking of two natures after the union. So, if we are to take this guy's exegesis, then we shall not speak of two natures, but we can speak of natures. Excuse me, but that's the stupidest, the lowest IQ nonsense I have ever read in my life. I'm very sorry to say this, but that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I hope you actually read your own argument and reflect on that. Please do that, because this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So there are natures, but no, we can't use number on them. We can't say two, right? We can't say two. That's like if I was debating with a Muslim, and I said, oh, we believe in one God, and he said, well, don't you believe that there are like three persons? Oh, we believe in the persons. We don't say they're three, because then that will mean division. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. I'm sorry. Can anyone tell me in the comments if I'm just being very idiotic? Please. This is not making any sense to me. We will find that Saint Gregory meets these requirements in that very same book where the forms are mentioned. When it is mingled with the divine, however, it no longer remains within its own limits and qualities, but is taken up towards what masters and transcends it. So what? I was neither gonna use cuss words, but no. So what? That's the same thing St. Leo says. Dummy. That's the whole point of me quoting that. The first argument of the partisans was that you can't speak of two natures. No. You can't do that. And now, you can speak of it, but you need to qualify. So they're just adding. It's like a hydra, right? You refute one of their objections, they come up with two more. And that's why it's so difficult dealing with these people. That's why I get frustrated sometimes, right? Does each form perform its own act? No, that's exactly what we say too. We don't think that the forms are concrete subjects, but grammatically speaking, yes. In terms of written word, yes. But that only points to, let's say, to a great understanding. It only points out that some things are proper to the divine nature, some things are proper to the human nature. I don't even need to say this. A mentally ill 5-year-old can understand this. Please, use your brains. Does each form perform its own act? No. But the one incarnate Word who in the form of God emptied himself and was made in the form of a servant. We don't disagree with this. It's the same thing. So now let's move on to the orthodoxy of our fathers even more. Saint Ambrose in Exposition of the Christian Faith. This is cited by Saint Leo. That's what's significant about it, because Saint Leo cites a Theopaschism formula by Saint Ambrose. Saint Ambrose says, when we read then that the Lord of Glory was crucified, right, the title of the divinity, let us not suppose that he was crucified as in his glory, right? It is because he who is God is also man, God by virtue of his divinity and by taking upon him of the flesh, the man Christ Jesus, that the Lord of Glory is said to have been crucified. For possessing both natures, that is the human and the divine, he endured the passion in his humanity. God endured the passion in his humanity, in order that without distinction he who suffered should be called both Lord of Glory and Son of Man, even as it is written, who descended from heaven. Another Theopaschism formula from St. Leo. And by the way, one of the points that I made is that there was a 5-day commission, special commission headed by Anatolius, that cross-checked the Tome of Leo with St. Cyril's writings. So people dissented, those people that dissented were the Illyrian bishops and the Palestinian bishops. So both of these bishops, what they did is that, well, he speaks of two forms operating, that sounds Nestorian to me. And then they cross-checked with St. Cyril to see whether the writings are compatible. And in the Council of Chalcedon, they all said, yes, they are indeed compatible. So let's go. Both of the representatives said, now we accept the Tome of Leo because we checked St. Cyril's writings. And why is Leo said to be why do they say that Peter spoke through Leo? Because he said the same thing St. Cyril said, is the same thing. They say this in the Chalcedonian Council as well, right? So the basis of orthodoxy in the Council of Chalcedon is St. Cyril of Alexandria, not St. Leo. And Honigman computes that out of the 145 bishops at Ephesus II, 119 attended Chalcedon. So most of the bishops that said left is right, at Chalcedon they said left is left. This is the defense of St. Eutyches. He died in 473. He defends the council by appealing to Cyrillian theology. He implies the acceptance of the 12 chapters, right? So this proves that the Chalcedonian defense included the defense of Cyril's theology and his chapters. This points out that the reason why Ibas and Theodoret's condemnations, the reason why they got their sees back is not because of their theology or because they're so great, but it is to reverse what Ephesus II did, because Ephesus deposed both of them in absentia. That is uncanonical. Okay, that is uncanonical. Ephesus II did many things that were uncanonical, and Chalcedon reversed all of these things. And by the way, isn't it hypocritical to attack us because we reinstated Theodoret Ibas when the people that did it 2 years ago reinstated Eutyches and anathematized and deposed two major patriarchs? 1 year later, they anathematized St. Leo. Now, St. Leo removed Dioscorus' name from the diptychs, but Dioscorus' response to that was deposition. Complete anathema. So, Dioscorus, to save Eutyches, anathematized 3 major patriarchs to save some stupid archimandrite. How anyone sees this as an ecumenical council is beyond me. I'm sorry. This deals with the letter to Marie and whether Ibas was the one who really wrote it. So, if you read Chalcedon in context, this was written after Richard Price translated the Acts. He points out that actually, letter to Marie really might not have been from Ibas himself, but just something that was attributed to him. And Ibas's partisans, supporters of the 3 chapters, Rusticus and Facundus, searched the archives of Constantinople for the supposed missing evidence that Ibas's the letter to Marie is attributed to Ibas. They couldn't find it, but they should have been able to find it if that really existed, right? So, in regards to St. Leo, I mentioned that the Tome of Leo is very important because it explicates the doctrine of 2 energies and 2 wills of Christ, and that's the reason why the Orientals also rejected it. Here you see St. Sophronios using the Tome of Leo in defending the 2 energies and the 2 wills of Christ. You can see the source. Moving on to the next one. Paul claimed during the debate that Eutyches was rejected even after he accepted Christ being consubstantial with us. That's a total lie. Eutyches rejected Christ's double consubstantiality throughout the council. Okay, so that's a complete lie. He made up stupid reasons. He said, well, I don't see this in the scripture. So he basically appealed to scripture. And he said, I don't care about what the fathers say. I appeal to scriptures. Right? I appeal to Nicaea. I appeal to scriptures. That's his defense. So they did not get a satisfactory answer. That's why we got rid of Eutyches. That's the person that you tried to save. So now let's get to the Chalcedonian definition. And I made this argument numerous times, but here are the red parts are Cyrillian terms. Blue part is the Leonine term that is turned into a Cyrillian term, right? Christ is made known in two natures. The natures are not confused. It's not changed. They're not divided. It's not separated. And here are on the right, Cyril's letters. One of them is from, I forgot which letters were they from, but the middle one is from the Formula for Union. The other might be from his letter to Soccensis, second and third, where he says the same thing, and the Chalcedon definition used those terminology exactly. And here are the people. There was a commission that rewrote the second draft of the definition. Now, this is very important because nearly everyone that wrote the definition was a Cyrillian. They weren't Nestorians. None of them were allies of Theodoret. Right? What was the character of the membership of the committee? Apart from Anatolius and the Roman delegates, no fewer than 13 of the remaining 18 had supported Dioscorus at Ephesus too. 3 of them had been suspended at the end of the first session. The only bishop from Syria was Maximus of Antioch, a belligerent supporter of Cyrillian theology, consecrated bishop by Anatolius, while the latter was still supporting Dioscorus. Right? Remember, Anatolius was consecrated by Dioscorus himself. The list contains no known allies of Theodoret, while one of the other members, Basil of Traianopolis in Rhodope, had in the first session expressed approval of his condemnation. Eusebius of Dorylaeum was also on the committee, but he was no ally of the Antiochians. In the fifth session, he had opposed amending the draft definition to satisfy the Roman delegates. Right? So he opposed the amending of the first draft that contained out of two natures. So he supported the out of two natures formula, but he was nevertheless part of the committee. So how can anyone claim that Chalcedon is Nestorian when these are the definition is Nestorian, when the definition has Cyrillian quotations, the definition was written by Cyrillian people? How can it be Nestorian is completely beyond me. You'd have to provide a lot of evidence to prove this, and so far many of the evidences, if not all of them, are simply not true and inaccurate and not factual. The amending committee was obliged to assert a continuing duality in Christ, but the formula used to do so, acknowledged in two natures, had been coined by Basil of Seleucia. He's a very important character because he himself defended miaphysitism as well. And as well, if you look at the footnotes, this is from, I believe, Acts of Chalcedon, or I think it is from Acts of Chalcedon. The formula came later to be understood as equivalent to Cyril's formula that Christ is two in contemplation alone. Richard Price also agrees with me. So we have 4 scholars agreeing with my point. In other words, that duality arises in the mind that analyzes Christ, while the reality is of a perfect unity of being. This interpretation was formally adopted in Canon 7 of the Fifth Ecumenical Council too. All right? Exactly what we say. So let's collect the proofs of Chalcedon not being Nestorian. The distinction of natures is in epinoia. It's not a concrete distinction, therefore a prosopic union is impossible. The Theopaschism is evident in the Tome of Leo. There is patristic support for the Tome of Leo. Ephesus 1 is accepted, therefore the 12 chapters are also accepted. The Cyrillic Chalcedonian interpretation is the only dogmatic interpretation due to the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Ebus and Theodorus' acceptance is based on reversing the Second Council of Ephesus and their uncanonical decisions, not because of their theology. Only 2 people in the council said the letter to Marie was orthodox, supposedly. Right? Supposedly they said that. when in reality they might have even talked about another letter. We're not even certain if this letter was a letter to Marie or if it was a letter of Eutyches and Photius. We're not even sure if it was Ibas that wrote the letter. So the only strong claim that they have is uncertain itself. The definition was written by Cyrillians. The Tome of Leo is interpreted by Cyrillian theology. In two natures after the union has patristic backing. Does one nature only have any backing? No, its only backing is from Arians and Apollinarians. And in spite of all of these, somehow Chalcedon is still an Nestorian council. Make your own judgment, ladies and gentlemen. That's all I'm going to say. Now let's get to other topics. One of the questions that were asked to Paul is, how do you feel about your own bishops rejecting essence and energy's distinction? So I wasn't aware of this. This was brought to my attention. Apparently, Metropolitan Bishop of Damietta argues for created grace, right? And he says that we have a different view of the energies than Gregory Palamas. And so he says, he uses the liturgy, his own liturgy, to say that God is the creator of grace. This proves that grace is created and not God himself. So first of all, we don't say grace equals God. We don't say that. So there's a misunderstanding of our theology. But the Oriental Orthodox position believes in created grace. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, that's polytheistic because now there's a created divinity and an uncreated divinity, as St. Gregory Palamas will say. That means we cannot be deified. Theosis is impossible because it's a created medium that makes us deified. But that's not deification. That's not proper deification. It's impossible. And when St. Cyril and St. Athanasius say that we become gods by grace, does that mean that we become created gods? Again, more indication of polytheism. This doctrine of created grace, it fits Mormons more, but it doesn't fit Christians. So, the final section, which is an important point that I want to discuss a little bit. And it's been longer than an hour. I was kind of thinking of limiting to less than an hour, but whatever. We talked a lot of different things in this debate review. So the question of whether St. Cyril is Miaphysite or Diophysite is very important, and I will be arguing, and this is a very bold argument, that St. Cyril of Alexandria is not primarily a Miaphysite, but actually a Diophysite. I used to have the opinion that he was primarily a Miaphysite, but now I'm starting to change my opinion in light of what I read from Hans van Loon's book. And remember when Paul said that, in the Hans van Loon book, he says that the two natures is in contemplation only. So he said, there's a quotation in the book. I asked him what the page is. He couldn't bring me the page, but he had the notes in front of him. So really, that's a question mark. I mean, and I read the book myself. I don't think I don't think he thought that I will read the book, but I did read the book. And if you read the section where Hans van Loon talks about St. Cyril speaking of into natures, he's not speaking of it in any Miaphysite sense. So let's get to what is being said here. How often does St. Cyril of Alexandria employ the Miaphysis formula? In the writings of the first 2 years of the Nestorian controversy, we encounter it only 2 times, once in Contra Nestorium and once in the quotation Oratio ad Dominas. In comparison, united according to hypostasis is found 17 times in Contra Nestorium alone, 4 times in the second letter to Nestorius, 5 times, blah, blah, blah. So, hypostatic union is his favorite term, right? United according to hypostasis. This is exactly what we say. So now they're going to say, but he's speaking of 2 hypostases united. Yeah, right, sure. So it may be added that, so this is the important part, right? So the 2 times in the first 2 years of the controversy, in his Oratio ad Dominas, he quotes the Apollinarian forgery that is attributed to St. Athanasius, but his reason for quoting that is because it contains the term Theotokos. So that's not because of Miaphysis, right? He quotes in Contra Nestorium, but it's only in the context of, he uses Miaphysis formula in Contra Nestorium without any quotations, but it's only for the analogy of soul and body, right? So he basically says, out of 2 realities, there's one separate reality. This is no different than what we say, right? So there's, before the reunion with the Orientals in 433, there's only one other work of Cyril in which he speaks of one nature, and that's in against the Orientals. But guess what? He's using the same Apollinarian forgery to prove that there's only one worship, contra two worships of the Antiochians. So the three instances before 433 that he used the mia physite formula, two of them wasn't even to use mia physis. So only one of them, only once, right? Only one time. And so this begs the question whether St. Cyril of Alexandria really was mia physite. And here is my theory. Here's what I'm going to be saying. Is that mia physis as a formula was appreciated by the Alexandrians, not by St. Cyril. And St. Cyril was kind of forced to use that formula because his fellow partisans liked the formula because, hey, there's a patristic support and that we can use them against Nestorians. Now, Antiochians, when they heard St. Cyril say mia physis the first time, they claimed that he was Apollinarian. Now, Apollinarius is from Syria. Many of the Antiochians are Syrians. So, put two and two together. Surely they will know that mia physis was Apollinarius' formula. And from 6th century scholarship on to 21st century scholarship, we all know that every single instance of the supposed mia physis formula that we see in the Fathers, except for St. Cyril, all of them are forgeries. Lietzmann's book on Apollinarius of Laodicea is very good on this topic. I'll definitely recommend checking it out. But a very good evidence is that the Syrians themselves, when they heard that formula, said, that's Apollinarian, right? And once St. Cyril explained himself, then they said, oh, okay, it's not Apollinarian then. So this is something different. So keep this in mind. This is very important because it shows to us that the mia physis, the strict mia physitism is not patristic. It's not patristic. It's anti-patristic. Its backing is from heretics, right? And is there in any sense that we can use it in an orthodox manner? Yes, we can use it in an orthodox manner. But only using that formula is not at all acceptable. And we cannot do that. That's why we use Diophysitism, because it has patristic backing, both in terminology, but also in its substance. As we have seen, many of the fathers argue that they use many various Diophysite terminology. And if you watch my Miaphysis and Diophysis video, what's really significant about these two terms is that they indicate the properties of the natures as two as well. So Will's energies are also two, and this will become very important in a monothelite controversy. And this is why the severance are monothelites and monoenergies. And again, I'm up to debating on this topic. I'm very willing to debate on the controversy of wills and energies. I will say, however, that if they don't want to do this, then I can just as easily do it on my own. No problem there whatsoever. So that's all I'm going to be saying for this video. Thank you all for watching. I know that I was maybe perhaps a bit feisty in this video. Maybe a bit frustrated, maybe a bit angry, but it's really to emphasize certain things, right? And that's kind of my style, right? It's just my style. Because some people, they do even worse things and they say, that's my style. So I don't think it hurts a bit too much. So thank you all for watching this. I would like to apologize if I've been not good. I am very aware that I did interrupt numerous times in the debate. I had a purpose, but I also know it's a dick move, and I'm willing to accept that. And if I have to be called a dick to keep the debate on a certain topic, and for us to chase after truth, then so be it. I don't care. I don't mind that. But I would like to again thank Craig Truglia for moderating. Great person. He deserves more subscribers. He deserves more, let's say, more people looking at him. He's definitely worth checking out. Thank you to Mr. Daniel Kakish. Very intellectually honest. He might not understand the controversies, but he has the mindset to listen to the opposition, and I really appreciate that. I think he's very mature, and I hope that he manages to help people become better Christians. And thanks to Paul for debating me. I'd appreciate if you debated me earlier when I asked you to, but you wanted a public forum and you got it. So thank you for coming to the scene. I would love to debate you again. If Severus is not able to debate, he's not hiding, he's not scared, he got sick. So, which is very unfortunate. Pray for him to be healed, pray for him to be Orthodox, pray for all of these people to be Orthodox, to be in the faith. And I'm willing to debate on this topic, but again, if no one's going to debate me, then I'm willing to keep chugging ahead. And yeah, that's all. Thank you all for watching this. I'll see you guys in the next video. God be with you all. Apologies if I was not good enough. Thank you.